Hi, Professor Reed. This is going to be and friends, classmates. This is going to be in 2 sections. I did the introduction and we were going to continue the video, but we're going to do the body and conclusions separately, only because I feel that I can't torture the people who have all gathered here with the 30th recitation of the introduction. So I hope that's okay. But anyway, Greg, start the clock. A life of faith may not always square with our beloved image of God, of a shepherd carrying his sheep, of a God who gives good gifts, not stones, to his kids. The Bible tells us about Jesus, that in him there is no darkness. And yet, can there be a mysterious side, a dark side to God that doesn't conform to what we think of him? C.F. Tate says of Psalm 88 and of God, without a dark side to God's character, he might become a tool in a one-sided relationship. This is something to think about. Darkness is the last word of the Psalm of Lament, and darkness and desolation is a hallmark of the psalm. It is unique from all other psalms because there is no praise given to God, there is no glory given to God, there is no silver lining expressed by the psalmist. Some call it a Holocaust psalm because after World War II, the Jewish people were trying to find an explanation of a God who seemingly was silent. And they looked to Psalm 88. And yet the psalmist cries out in the midst of God's silence. As Leonard Meyer says, the poet is drowning in dark waters, completely and utterly alone. Darkness is his only friend. He is in the realm of chaos and evil, and yet he cries out. He refuses to let God go. In fact, in verse 9, this is how bad it gets for the psalmist. He says, "My eye has become dim through affliction." In the Bible, the eye represents the whole person, his or her health and vitality. When the eyes grow dim, one is losing her life force. The psalmist here has so much sorrow pressing in on him, his eye grows dim, and it indicates that he is passing into the realm of death. My dad died a few years back, and I happened to be traveling in Africa at the time when I learned the news. And it was the first major loss I've ever had. And I had both my parents, and before I left for the trip, I said to both of them, no crises. You know, you go away and you just, it's the unexpected. It's the person coming into the emergency room who has just had to learn a spouse has collapsed in the parking lot. For me, it was learning that my dad had died in Florida. And I was alone. I was with my colleagues, but I was alone in a hotel room. And without any kind of family support, I felt fear from head to toe. My body was in chaos, my spirit, I couldn't feel the presence of God, and yet I called out over and over to Jesus. Looking back on it now, this was my expression of faith. If we look at Psalm 88, we hear accusations of a silent and absent God, despair and suffering, but again, we also see faith in relationship. Faith is not always a feeling. The psalmist is not feeling it here. It's often obedience in the midst of chaos and horror that is most honoring to God. The psalmist believed that God could change his circumstances, could intervene, and I believe the same. As we look to our leaders in the Christian community and immerse ourselves in church culture, we get an idea of how a life of faith in crisis works. And we get a view of the end of life. But can we picture it? Is it the pastor's wife who's praising God on Facebook? Is it the stoic widower that you run into at the store? Is it the parents you see at church that always have a silver lining to their child's death? Are they projecting a culture that avoids thinking about tragedy and death? I mean the wider culture, or a church that wants to put grief and dying and death into a box and separate it from the congregation? Have you thought about that? Pause. Let's continue. Just concluding for you today, for me, crying out to God was an expression of faith. It said, I believe, Jesus, that you are there. I believe you hear me. I believe you are God. I believe you can change my circumstances. And it's similar to the psalmist in Psalm 88. Though his eye grows dim, he is still crying out to God, a God that he has a relationship with. In fact, in verse 1, he says, Yahweh, my God, who delivers. He said, I have called to you, Yahweh, every day I have spread out my hands to you. Here the psalmist is speaking of a sustained relationship. For me, a life of faith in Africa was calling out to Jesus, but it was also the faith of friends who held me while I traveled, while it took 3 days to get home, traveling through Brussels, traveling out of Africa, and to get home. They kept me afloat by their faith, believing that Jesus had his arms around me and was going to walk me through this journey, beginning of faith. And I believe we all need somebody like that in our lives. But life is hard, and we can't have a preconceived notion of how faith is going to work in any particular circumstance. But we can find it in the Psalms. Anyway, thank you for listening to me today. Sorry I went a little over. But blessings to you. I'm going to be around if anyone has any questions or would like to talk. I'll be here today. So thank you again for having me.